Hello, I'm Peter LeBrie, aka Peter03102. Today is Friday, October 1 at about 10 in the morning. And this video is about the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his functions. We'll start off with two people who are very important to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the President and the Secretary of Defense. The President, according to Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States. Then in 1947, the President is Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces of the United States. And they included the Air Force, but essentially that means all armed forces from here on will all be underneath the President. In Title 10, Subtitle A, Part 1, Chapter 2, in Section 111, it says the Department of Defense is an executive department of the United States. Executive department means it's part of the executive branch of government, which would be underneath the President of the United States. That details how it falls under the President as far as the structure of the U.S. government. The Secretary of Defense, Title 10, U.S. Code, Subtitle A, Part 1, Chapter 2. In Section 113, Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense, who is the head of the Department of Defense, appointed from civilian life by the President, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. A person may not be appointed as Secretary of Defense within 7 years after relief from active duty as a commissioned officer of a regular component armed force. The Secretary is a principal assistant to the President on all matters concerning the Department of Defense, subject to the direction of the President and to this title and Section 2 of the National Security Act of 1947. So the Department of Defense is actually run by the Secretary of Defense. He is the head honcho, the boss. And the President is Commander-in-Chief because he's the head of the executive branch. The executive branch has, as part of it, one of its departments is the Department of Defense. Now we'll go on to the actual, what is a Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? The broad functions of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are set forth in Title 10, United States Code, and detailed in the DOD Directive 5100.1. I found that information on the JCS.MIL website, which is the website for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at a page on that website for the Chairman. I might like to add this point that you will find below in the description of this video a link to a blog from which you will find all the links and all the passages taken out from Title 10, Directive 5100.1, the Constitution, and other places. They'll be detailed in that blog. Title 10 is kind of difficult to understand exactly what the Chairman is supposed to be doing because it has things like you are supposed to advise on this, you're supposed to advise on that, you're supposed to advise on that, you're supposed to plan this, you're supposed to plan that, you're supposed to plan that, you're supposed to organize this, you're supposed to organize that, and it's like a laundry list. And that really doesn't tell me what the Chairman is supposed to do. It also says that it's detailed in the DOD Directive 5100.1. It says that in paragraph 3 of that page from the JCS.MIL website. So we'll go on to that directive. It starts off by saying all functions of the Department of Defense are performed under the authority, direction, and control of Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense is the highest office of the Department of Defense. He's a civilian, not a military person, because we want to separate the military from what actually runs the country. He could have been part of the military like 7 years ago. He could have been an officer. But in the last 7 years, at very least, or maybe he was never part of the military, he cannot be part of the military for at least the last 7 years as an officer. Next we have providing immediate staff assistance and advice to the Secretary of Defense, the OSD, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Those separately identified and organized shall function in full coordination and cooperation. Now the OSD is the Office of the Secretary of Defense. That's his staff. That's under him. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff are all the people that essentially are the upper level of the people that run the Department of Defense. There are Joint Chiefs of Staff for the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. The Navy also includes the Marines and the Coast Guard, and the Air Force apparently now includes Space Force, which sort of makes sense. But still leaves the Army all by itself. So the Secretary of Defense, the Office of is the OSD, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the JCS. The chairman of the JCS is the CJCS. He's the spokesman and the head honcho of the JCS. OSD is the principal staff element of the Secretary of Defense in the exercise of policy and development, planning, resource management, fiscal and program evaluation oversight, and interface and exchange with other U.S. government departments and agencies, foreign governments, and international organizations through formal and informal processes. OSD also performs oversight and management of defense agencies and DOD field activities. So those are some of the responsibilities of the OSD that we really won't talk about very much. But the OSD is part of the government that would actually interact with foreign governments under the direction of the Secretary of Defense, who is their boss. He's the boss of everybody in the OSD. He's the boss of everybody in the JTS, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Joint Chiefs of Staff. So they take care of the policy, the foreign governments, the interface with other parts of the U.S. government, the USG. Next, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are responsible to the President and Secretary of Defense for the functions assigned to them. Obviously, because Secretary of Defense is the boss of the Department of Defense, and the President is the overall boss, a bunch of departments, including the Department of Defense. So he'll be like the Commander-in-Chief of the military and the head of the criminal law area, which would be like Commander-in-Chief of the FBI, I would imagine, something like that. The operational chain of command runs from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the commanders of the combatant commands. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff functions within the chain of command by transmitting to the commanders of the combatant commands the orders of the President or the Secretary of Defense. So the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CJCS, is only part of the chain of command in that it carries communications from the President or the Secretary of Defense to command. I'm just shortening up it to command. He also carries communications from command up to the President and to the Secretary of Defense. Orders to such commanders shall be issued by the President, Secretary of Defense, or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with the authority and direction of the President or the Secretary of Defense. And this means that all communications comes from the President or the Secretary of Defense. It doesn't come from anybody else. Except for one instance, he doesn't actually communicate his own communications to command. This one instance is located in the latter part, where the chairman can issue it under the authority and direction of the President or the Secretary of Defense. If a communication that's given to him and he is authorized to do it, because they'll actually tell him that you should actually see this carried out. You may be given a communication that's too complicated to be like one communication that gets to one person. It needs organizing and planning. It needs different people in different places doing things. It needs to be overseen so that the CJCS, the chairman, can report back to the President or the Secretary of Defense on what's going on. If there's a problem, he can report that back to them. Communication from the President or Secretary of Defense to the commanders of the combatant commands shall be transmitted through the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff unless otherwise directed. Communications from the commanders of the combatant commands to the President or Secretary of Defense shall be transmitted through the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff unless otherwise directed. All the communications back and forth between at one end the President and the Secretary of Defense and the other end, which is command, goes through the Chairman, the CJCS. Unless in special cases, like the soldier was in front of the President. The President says, do this for me. And he says it right to the soldier. Of course, the soldier's going to obey him because he's like a commander-in-chief. So that would be a special circumstance where a communication was given that bypassed the chairman. But those occasions don't happen very often. They just happen occasionally. Usually all communications will run through the chairman. Communications addressed to the commanders of the combatant commands by other authority normally shall be coordinated with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If anybody else in the U.S. government wanted to communicate with command, they'll have to send it through the chairman, the CJCS. He has to keep a log. He has to keep copies and a log of all these communications so that it can be reviewed by the President and or by the Secretary of Defense if there's any questions about these communications. Because these communications can't actually be like commands, because the only person who can actually issue commands would be the President or Secretary of Defense. But there may be occasion where other government agencies, other entities of the U.S. government, other departments may wish to send a communication to command. And they have to do that through the chairman, through the CJCS. Subject to the authority, direction, and control of the Secretary of Defense, the chairman acts as the spokesperson. So he can make public statements. He can go to a press conference and make statements at the press conference. But the statements he makes and what he has to put forward has to come from the Secretary of Defense, because the Secretary of Defense is his boss. He's going to say, well, you can talk about this and that, but not about this. These are the things you're authorized to talk about in this press conference or with reporters or etc. That's because Secretary of Defense, he's the boss of boss of the CJCS. He's the boss of the entire Department of Defense. The President and the Secretary of Defense may assign other duties to the Chairman to assist the President and the Secretary of Defense in performing their functions, their command functions. So the only people who can assign other duties to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the President and the Secretary of Defense. They may do this to offload some command functions because all this is too much work for them to be doing. And they can assign this work onto the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But he is doing this work under direction, supervision of the President and the Secretary of Defense. And he's only doing extra tasks that are assigned to him by the President or Secretary of Defense. Because Secretary of Defense is his boss in the Department of Defense, and the President is the boss of the entire military. Hence, only those two people can actually do things like that. So, to summarize, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CJCS, job is Principal Military Advisor to the President, Secretary of Defense, and National Security Council. You'll find that written all over the place on various websites. I use the advisor. Carries communications from the President or Secretary of Defense to command. He carries communications from command to the President or Secretary of Defense. Carries and logs communications from other USG, United States government entities, to command. And they're logged because, of course, we don't want anything communicated to command that the President and the Secretary of Defense and the CJCS also don't know about. So they should know what the communications are. So they have to be given a copy, the CJCS has to be given a copy of the command of the communication, so they can put into his own log, as well as the communication that actually goes to command. So we have a log and copies of all communications that went down to command. Other duties assigned by the President and Secretary of Defense relating to command functions. And these are not defined in Directive 5100.1, but these two people, these two people, the President and Secretary of Defense, can assign him other duties. With the authority and direction of the President or the Secretary of Defense, the CJCS, the chairman, in order to see that some communication is carried out, can issue communications and orders of his own in this instance. But these orders and communications has to facilitate. They have to be towards getting this done. What the President or the Secretary of Defense want done has to be in getting that done. Finally, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is responsible to the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense. These two people are the highest people in the government. And that's it for my live stream on YouTube. Again, I'd like to mention that I have my blog linked underneath. And in the blog, there'll be more information. Virtually everything I gave you will be written down. Not quite in those words, except for the one areas where I read a quote, which sounded like a quote, from the Directive 5100.1. which is where I got all information. And thank you very much for watching my video. Over and out.